Nelson, alcoholic addict. That is not my real name. That is a phony name that I came up with for this newsletter. I recently read a Fox Sports profile of Maxx Crosby. Crosby is a great young NFL player for the Las Vegas Raiders. He plays defensive end. He's a really good player. He got sober a few years ago, and it's a cool story. So I included a link in it to it on my written part of this, and I'm fascinated by the concept of being rich and famous and young while trying to get sober, because I just don't know if I could have done that. And Crosby is doing it in Las Vegas, of all places. Can't even imagine, I got sober because I was spiritually bankrupt, but actual bankruptcy played a part too. I wasn't literally bankrupt, but I was about $100,000 in debt, mostly on credit cards. So that number got bigger and bigger, like by $500 every day, probably. It was ugly. And if I had had millions of dollars to play with, I might have needed more time to hit rock bottom. And I also think if I had been rich, I might have gone to one of those fancy beach rehabs where you ride horses and frolic on the beach and decide when to come and go. And frolicking would not have been good for me either. I need a rehab that made me feel like I never wanted to go back to rehab. And that's what I got. But in that profile of Maxx Crosby, I was especially interested in a section about him when he was in college at Eastern Michigan. And Eastern Michigan is not exactly a powerhouse college football program. So Crosby was big time, big man on campus there. Great football player, a smaller school. I mean, it's a recipe for being king of the world. And in the story, there's some anecdotes of people starting to say, hey, we think Max might have a problem, when he was getting into some trouble. And more often than not, other people would act surprised and say, but what do you mean? He's playing great. And it was kind of true. He was playing great. But that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I've seen in recovery. I know a lot of very successful, very smart, very ambitious, very high-achieving people who have terrible addiction issues. It's possible. I would include myself in there for one or two of those categories, at least the ambitious part of it. When I went to rehab, I had a great job at a big, successful company, and I had two beautiful, healthy kids. I had a house and a strong, long-term relationship with my wife. I hadn't been arrested, 0 DUIs. I had no drunken car accidents. I hadn't actually had to file for bankruptcy. It was coming, but not yet. I had not been fired from my job. I hadn't even had an official overdose. Nobody had to use Narcan on me. I wasn't rushed to the hospital for anything. So for quite a few people in my life, they might have thought, geez, rehab, really? Like, you seem like you're doing fine. I wasn't. I was not doing fine. I needed rehab. Even though my life looked pretty damn good on paper, I must say. I think that's part of the reason that I didn't seek help sooner, and that's why that Maxx Crosby story is interesting, because he did seek help, even though he probably had plenty of money and people that would enable him and everything else. But it kept me from getting help sooner, and I had bought into. I mean, I'll blame Hollywood. It's not really Hollywood's fault, but I had bought into this Hollywood idea that drunks and drug addicts, they don't go to rehab until they go to prison for the 5th time or get fired and get divorced and all of these like terrible benchmarks. Then they go to rehab. And, the truth is some alcoholics and addicts, they do go to prison for the 5th time and then go to rehab. But others become CEOs or university presidents or college football All-Americans and NFL draft picks. And then they hit rock bottom. And for me, I was definitely struggling in every aspect of my life, but you might not have known it. If you met me, you might not have known it, but I knew it. I knew I felt broken every single day, and I had no idea. This is the best way to summarize it. I had no idea how to live life with drugs and alcohol, and I had no freaking idea how to live without drugs and alcohol either. And that is a bad place to be. That's the bottom. Jeez. So I really appreciated that part of the story. I go back and forth about whether to publicly talk about my own addiction and sobriety, and if I do it, like what principles do you apply regarding anonymity, and But I do enjoy reading. Personally, I enjoy reading those Maxx Crosby type stories because they're just great comeback stories of human beings, and I always get something out of them. And I bet a lot of other people do too. So thank you for letting me share.